Alright, what's going on, guys? Today we've got something very interesting to talk about. Very early this morning, the Edge magazine interview with Miyazaki dropped, and I gotta say, there is some wild stuff in there pertaining to the lore. Now, this whole issue of the magazine is really cool, and I recommend checking it out. And on a side note, at the end of the magazine, it includes an interview with Zullie the Witch and Vaati, which I thought was cool of them to do, but today we're gonna break down the things that I want to talk about the most. Because a lot of what goes on in this interview we've heard before. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button before we get into this. And we're going to start out going a little bit out of order, beginning with the discussion on the character I wanted to learn the most about, King Godfrey. The interviewer asked the question, "What can you tell us about the character on the cover of this issue?" And then Miyazaki replies by saying, "When we were talking with George Martin, we had these themes and ideas for creating pieces of artwork for the bosses, for these core characters of the story. And when he wrote the mythos, we asked him to create these dramatic heroes of this ancient mythos that takes place before the events of the game. These dramatic and heroic characters weren't really present in our previous titles, so this is something that was really appealing to me. How he would depict the mystique and heroic qualities of those characters. And Godfrey, the character on your cover artwork, is sort of an embodiment of that. He's one of the major players of the game. And that's something I want to talk about really quickly before we continue. This is one of the ways that Elden Ring really separates itself from the Souls games. In the past From Software titles, we would hear these tales of these heroes in other lands, and while those tales are really cool, they didn't really matter to our gameplay and our first-hand journey. And the thing that I'm really liking about the lore of Elden Ring so far is that these characters matter to our story. We're actually going to meet them and be able to fight alongside many of them. And not like in Dark Souls where all the characters are dead and decrepit and really don't have a sense of self anymore. In Elden Ring, a lot of these warriors and great heroes that we hear about are still in their prime. So to watch this story actually unfold firsthand, and have the actions we take along the way actually affect the world and the characters around us, it's gonna be a very, very nice change of pace compared to the past games we've played. But let's get into the juicy stuff now. One of the motivations for the player character in Elden Ring is to become an Elden Lord. They're to journey to the lands between and become the next Elden Lord. In the sort of heyday of the Golden Order of the lands between, there were two Elden Lords, and Godfrey was the first of these. He was the very first Elden Lord, and was married to the eternal Queen Marika, who's been detailed in some of the lore we've released publicly so far. And he was representative of this period of grandeur and affluence. He represents everything great about the Elden Ring and about the lands between at that time. Eventually, he was exiled from the lands between. He himself became tarnished, and he shares this deep connection with the tarnished, the player character. Godfrey is an embodiment of their long history and struggle. He represents a lot of what the player character stands for, and he symbolizes a deep connection with the player, something that used to shine brilliantly and has now become tarnished and fallen from grace. Now, there were like 50 bombshells that we need to dive into in that, but real quick, let me read this next small paragraph before we begin our breakdown. The interviewer asked, "There are tentacle motifs across the blade of Godfrey's poleaxe, which suggests a connection to the ocean. Is that a part of the world we can expect to navigate in the finished game?" To which Miyazaki replies, "What I will say is that he's a character with a major presence in this story, and he represents not only a great part of the player character's role, but also a large part of the world and its history. And so, without spoiling too much, I just want to say, as a character that represents so much of the game, he's definitely one who I find very appealing and very attractive in that game. And I think there's a lot to explore there for the players." And then there's a little subsection that reads, "The lands between reminds us of a glorious past that has fallen to ruin. Will you be able to salvage their corrupted glory?" Okay, so we have a lot to discuss here. One of the first major points that he said in this was that Godfrey was actually the first of two Elden Lords. And this actually has a lot more to it than we might think. For there to have been a second Elden Lord, we need to actually think about what that constitutes. The title of Elden Lord in itself is kind of an enigma at this point. We still don't know what the heck the Elden Ring actually is. Miyazaki describes it as more of an abstraction. It's a representation of something metaphysical, and that the Elden Ring gives power to the Golden Order. And when asked about the logo of the game, he replied, "The rings that you're looking at in the logo are not so much a representation of those factions, as you put it, but more a representation of the law of the world, the rules, and the order. This Golden Order is something that the Elden Ring may have once represented, but not directly. It's more about how you apply those rules and how you enforce them on the physical world and what effects they have on it. So it's more the influence of these demigods that existed a long time before and how they applied those concepts of order and discipline. That's what's being represented by the Elden Ring and those overlapping and intersecting rings. It gets a little bit more complicated than that, but I'll leave it there for now." So basically what he's saying is that the Golden Order in itself was actually the conjoined minds of the demigods, enacting the powers of the Great Runes, to create the physics and laws of the world at that time, and not laws determining the way people acted, but rather the way matter works in the world. So then we have to ask ourselves, what could the Elden Ring possibly be? Well, now we know it's a metaphysical concept, but if that's true, then where do the runes come from? Are the runes a physical manifestation of the grace, the blessing given to the inhabitants of the lands between? If that were true, then that would make the great runes the powers that the demigods have, purposefully given by the greater will to them for some reason. But that would ultimately mean that the demigods aren't the bad guys in this story. So then what is the purpose of us searching out the great runes? The more I read about this, the more it really seems like the Tarnished are actually the villains in this story. Look at the way Miyazaki described Godfrey. He wasn't always tarnished. He became tarnished after some event, which ultimately led to his exile. But he's described as this great warrior king who made the world perfect before he became tarnished. Now we don't know what this event is, but we know what characterizes a tarnished. A tarnished can be identified by the loss of grace in their eyes. I'm sure there's a lot more to it, but that is what we know so far. So this makes me think that the ideal job of the Elden Lord is actually to govern the demigods, to make sure all the laws that they're enacting through the great runes are proper. Now I don't know if that's true, but it would be logical in the sense of everything else that we know. Now we know at some point there was a betrayal that led to the shattering, the stealing of the Rune of Death, and the death of many of the demigods. Now presumably this event takes place after the exile of the Tarnished, which may or may not put it in line at the time of the second Elden Lord. Now my first thought on who this second Elden Lord might be would be Queen Marika. We know she was the wife of Godfrey and the mother of the demigods, and also the current ruler of the lands between. But I doubt it would be that simple. There's definitely a slew of characters we don't know about yet working in the shadows, who seemingly want to bring out the death of the Erd Tree and usher in a new age. Now, in lieu of all these new questions that we just had, there's a lot more going on in this interview that we're going to cover at a later date, but for now I want to leave you with a Celtic myth I think could play into this, and that is of the Queen of Winter. The Queen of Winter is one of the mythical deities that controlled the weather and the seasons. And here are just a few points from her stories that I've taken out of context, but I think are very interesting. The Queen of Winter is said to be an old hag of two faces, but she is immortal. One side is the old immortal woman, but the second side is one that she sent down to take the form of a human and usher in the end of winter. In contrast to the Queen of Winter's form, the second face is said to be that of a young woman who did many things in her time as a human, but is characterized in one tale as manipulating a great hero to go on a search for a ring that ultimately brought about a very bad end for him. Now, as I said, this interview has a lot more to it, and we're going to cover that at a later time, but for now, I just wanted to bring all these new questions that we learned from this. The character of Godfrey is so fascinating to me, and it's definitely going to take a lot more investigation to figure out him more. But as of now, that's all for this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on it and subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll catch you in the next one.